Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to episode 43 of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, and today we bring on Deon Daugherty to talk about RigZone, and not just RigZone, but a lot of stuff. And RigZone is a huge name in the industry. If you've been looking for a job or news, they are one of the places that you would go to. And so we get into OPEC, we get into offshore drilling, Mexico, the Gulf Coast, all kinds of stuff. And actually a little bit of Twitter discussion at the end. So I hope you enjoy that. Here's my interview the other day with Deon Daugherty from RigZone. Well, Deon, I get a lot of emails from RigZone. I hear a lot about RigZone, but I don't think I've actually ever talked to someone from RigZone. So it's an honor to have you on today. How's it going?
Oh, well, it's going very well. It's a beautiful day in Houston, and I'm honored to be here representing RigZone. Thanks for having us.
Well, I want to get to RigZone in just a second, but I know you just got back from OTC, and my policy is I went to Houston 2 or 3 years in a row, and didn't, before I really was, offshore is not really where I deal at, and there was another event that I would go to that was the OTC week, and I would have to stay down by the beach, just to get a hotel during OTC week, and so now I make a policy. Unless I'm going to go to OTC, I don't go down there because it's so many. It's like, 80,000 people or something go down there for that event. It's huge. It's crazy. But you were there. Kind of tell us what you saw, what you experienced, and maybe some takeaways from OTC this year.
Sure. Well, I will begin by telling you that, yes, OTC is a logistical nightmare. I mean, those folks do their best, and they put on a good show, but it's a medium-sized town that sort of descends on Houston, which is the fourth, I think, largest city in the United States. So there's a lot of people, and I'm not surprised you had to stay down by the beach. And then if you throw in, rodeo or something, it gets really fun out here. But this year, there was, I think, more optimism at OTC. A lot of the booths were a bit smaller than they were 3 years ago before the downturn. But I think there was a noticeable improvement in just people being more positive this year than in the last couple of years about what could happen. Offshore, people are starting to talk about spending money again. People are starting to talk about hiring again. So, I think the outlook appeared to be pretty good from the folks who attended.
Well, you mentioned offshore there. I know going into 2017, there was a lot of talk about offshore may not be viable over the next decade. There was really doom and gloom. And so now what you're saying is that maybe the tide's going to turn and offshore is looking promising again? Parts
of it are. There's a couple of big fields, Thunder Horse and Mad Dog, where a lot of the major capital investment has already been spent. So production can carry on there. Break-evens can be below 50, closer to $40, $35 is what I'm hearing. And so they can make money. But that's in deep water. Shallow water, not so much. From what I'm hearing and what I've seen, the U.S. Gulf of Mexico shallow water is not in great shape. It's probably in the worst shape it's been in 20 years, and it's probably not going to come back simply because there's not, one fella told me it's the size of the prize, and the size of the prize in shallow water is just not there on the U.S. side. Now, Mexico might be a little different. There could be a lot of growth out there. I talked to a fella from McDermott who was very optimistic about shallow water and deep water from Mexico's side of things. But for the U.S., they are producing. I wouldn't expect to see a lot of new investment, at least the initial capital investment, because it's still expensive. It's still high risk. But fields, like I said, Thunder Horse and Mad Dog, they're going to do well. They're going to produce, and people are going to make money off those fields.
What makes the Mexican shallow water better than the U.S. shallow water right now?
Mexico's, shallow water in Mexico is virtually untapped. So, where the U.S. side was several decades ago, before they made their big finds, that's where Mexico is because of the energy reforms. People are now, foreign companies are now going to have access to tap those markets, to tap the shallow water plays and the deep water plays too, but shallow is a lot easier to get into from a finance perspective. But on the U.S. side, whenever their find dries up, a lot of the infrastructure, the pipelines, the platforms have to come up too. So it's not as though you can go into shallow water and just connect up to pipelines and infrastructure that's already there. You've got to do it yourself. So that's another expense. And then also, a lot of what's been found most recently in the U.S. shallows has been gas, and gas just isn't what people are wanting to drill for now. So I think there's down to about 3 or 4 players. At one point there was more than 25. my folks who I've talked to, several experts, including one here, if I could plug RigZone, our RigZone data services guy, was just saying that there's not so much the big finds in the shallows in the U.S. And like I said, Mexico, who knows? I mean, the sky's the limit there.
Okay, now, question for you about Mexico. I've looked at doing some work in Mexico, and I know a lot of companies that have gone down there. And someone told me just the other day, they said, okay, we signed a deal with Pemex, but we're still not sure how that's going to play out. Because even though there's a lot of talk about the energy reform in Mexico, it seems like maybe there's still some concern over how these contracts will actually be played out, how the government's going to work out all its kinks. Did you hear anything about that, or is it just pure optimism when you're talking about doing work in Mexico?
Oh, that's a good point, actually. There's still a long way to go. The process has been going on for, 3 years now, but it's brand new. Essentially, I think the contracts have to be worked out. That the regulatory side had not been touched before. Pemex already had leases, and then they knew how to do that, and they had a certain regulatory body. But my understanding is that a lot of the onshore, for example, there is no real regulatory regime in place, so they've got to do all of that still. They've got to figure out their contracts for if they want to develop shale. I know Pemex has done a couple of joint ventures, I think BHP, and so I think that's probably easier to do if it's a joint venture instead of, you're going down there fresh and starting. But there is a lot of optimism. But maybe I guess we should use that cliche cautious optimism. I was talking to a private equity firm just this morning, and they have more of let's kind of watch what's going to happen in Mexico before we start throwing our billions into it.
Right. And we're seeing here stateside, it seems like, that there's a lot of talk about how the U.S. is going to deal with foreign countries. And, we don't really know, okay, is President Trump the other day was talking about, repealing this certain policy, then he said he wasn't. And so it seems that even inside the U.S., where we're more of a free market economy, how we're going to deal with the world over the next 3 to 4 years might create some instability as well.
I think that's certainly fair to say. President Trump has made a lot of movement through executive order. And the thing about an executive order is it can be, it can happen real fast and it can go away real fast too. So I think that it's, taking that approach toward regulation instead of going through the legislative process, which then you have to go through the legislative process again to change, is a bit riskier. That's the right word, because you don't necessarily know that those changes are going to be in place, for 8 years down the road. Whereas if it were going through the legislative process, you've got to, they say it'll take an act of Congress for something to happen. That's because it takes forever. So I think there is some question, of how the repeals that the president wants to put forth. And, you saw what happened a week ago with the methane rule. It didn't make it through the Senate. So that was taking a legislative approach to changing something, and it died. Now it can come back. It can be attached to something else. It can come up as its own legislation. Or, I guess the president could do an executive order to change it. But it does create some, question marks on how things are going to change on the regulatory side here in the U.S. for companies that want to spend money here on oil and gas. And it's not a cheap endeavor. So it is something that they need stability. They want stability. Even the oil and gas markets, the prices don't like instability. People responding to prices don't like instability. So that causes some challenges, I think.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, left or right, when an executive order comes down and one side cheers and the other side boos. And I just kind of sit back and go, well, it could go away. It's not.
Yeah.
And so you have some kind of, so a lot of what Trump did, revoking President Obama's executive orders, you see how quick that can come and go. But that's a discussion for another day. One of the things that's fascinating me, though, is OPEC. There's been a lot of talk about OPEC, and I was kind of one of those in that group that said, okay, we're going to see OPEC kind of slowly dismantle over the next 5 to 10 years. I talked to an analyst the other day, and he's not so sure that's what's going to happen. He's saying that he thinks that OPEC is kind of, revitalized by what's going on here. They're playing a long-term game. They've kind of circled the wagons, if you will. What's your stance on OPEC and what's going on with them right now?
Oh, man, OPEC is fascinating. I had a similar conversation with an analyst. oh gosh, right before Christmas, I guess. Right after they made the decision and signed the paperwork and said, okay, we're going to do production cuts in January. And a lot of people were saying, oh, OPEC's not even relevant anymore. So I asked this analyst, who's one of the smartest guys in Houston, if that's the case. And he said, well, you and I are talking about it. People are talking to you about it, and that's why you're talking to me about it. So you tell me, are they relevant? And that was a really, kind of eye-opening way to look at it. And then, was it 10 years ago when OPEC, it might be longer than that, but OPEC was being approached to do something like production cuts. They were like, no way. Their bottom line at that point was we want market share. So they have market share now. Well, now they need price. And to attain a certain price point that they want, which they're going to need if they want to go forward with the Saudi Aramco IPO in 2019, I guess, they've got to do something. And they recognize that. But whether they're, becoming irrelevant or going to be dismantled, I don't think so. They've just got too much oil, and they've just got too much money, and they've just got too much at stake.
Okay, you mentioned the IPO, and I'm glad you did. This is something that, talk about fascinating. I'm really fascinated by this because when the IPO comes out, you said I think it's 2019 now. It just seems like that could be one of the straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will, because it's going to change the whole dynamics. And I was reading an article today talks about, well, other nations in OPEC are sitting back, and other companies inside those OPEC nations are sitting back going, well, maybe we should do the same thing here. So what do you think about the Saudi Aramco IPO and how that will change the dynamics, or do you think it won't really change much?
I think a lot of it, there's still a lot to be seen on that. I had skimmed through an article that I meant to go back and read through, but I didn't get to it. But it was saying
I know that feeling.
Yeah, there's just so much. But it had suggested that the reserves are not actually going to be part of what's put up for folks to buy into. It's not going to be part of the IPO. And I thought, well, gosh, I know Saudi Aramco has a whole lot of things going on, including solar. But it seemed like reserves would be, the sexiest thing to invest in, that you'd want a piece of. So if none of the reserves are on the block or, part of the IPO process, I'm sure it'll still be interesting. I'm sure people will still want to invest. But I think that will kind of dampen the enthusiasm somewhat if what you can actually invest in with Saudi Aramco is so narrow that it generates a lot of money for the company and for the country, really. But it doesn't go as far as people would like, outside of Saudi Aramco and outside of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be an interesting dynamic. One final thing about OPEC is the African nations, Nigeria specifically. It seems that, especially through this downturn, there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of discussion about what was happening inside of Nigeria. Whether I know that I met some folks from Nigeria, and they were kind of optimistic that the new government in place was kind of getting out corruption, and then you saw the oil pipeline that blew up and had all these problems. What's Nigeria's stance on all this stuff, and how are they handling the downturn and what's going on with the cuts and with OPEC in general?
Well, I'm about to sound like a real Texas girl here, but bless their heart, they just can't seem to catch a break. Nigeria had the Niger Delta Avengers, I think is what the group calls itself, blowing stuff up because they didn't feel like the common people were getting enough of the payout from the oil. And, maybe I'm not really one to comment on whether or not that's a legitimate point. I don't know, but I know that it was creating a lot of instability there. And when you're having to worry about your pipelines getting blown up, you probably don't want to invest, or you're not as inclined to invest in that country as you are somewhere else. So that does not bode well for Nigeria if they can't get the social, political unrest under control. And you mentioned Nigeria as part of the OPEC dynamic. Then you've got Libya, which has similar problems. There's lots of political unrest. There's stuff blowing up. Companies have to be cognizant of whether they want their folks there, whether they want to invest billions of dollars worth of infrastructure there. So really, they've got to get, back to Nigeria. Nigeria has got to get their political system or their socio-political problems under control before I think they can really take advantage of what OPEC or, OPEC and OPEC countries can do with cuts, can do with, trying to get the supply and demand equation back in balance.
Yeah, I remember one of the early articles, and I didn't follow the story, months and months after to kind of see, what was truth and what was fiction. But one of the earlier articles was reporting that it was a group that, kind of like you're saying, that hey, that the wages aren't high enough. And it's like, well, hey, hold on. How did you afford all these, explosives and AK-47s and all this stuff that they had? It's kind of an interesting dynamic there. And I know, talking
That's
to
a good point.
Yeah. It's one of those things. I didn't make it, unfortunately. And I'm not sure if it's even true or not, but it was just one of the things someone pointed out is you don't have money. How are you pulling this off? And talking to folks in Nigeria, it's such a complex situation there. And I don't pretend to understand it all for sure. So, but I want to turn now. You mentioned RigZone. So you're at RigZone. Tell us what you do there, and tell us about RigZone for the listeners who may not be familiar with it for some reason.
Well, sure. RigZone, we've been around about 15 years. Started out more of a job board website, and then they added content, news, and so that's sort of when I came in two and a half years ago as the reporter. I cover a lot of policy. We talked about regulations and what the president is doing and wants to do, OPEC. I cover a lot of finance, what private equity might want to do, where companies are getting their money, how they're investing it. And then a lot of what RigZone has to offer, and stemming from the job board, is employment news and what's happening in the market, what sectors are hiring. I mean, we were incredibly busy during the downturn, and I'm hoping that we're incredibly busy with the recovery for folks, all those 450,000, I think was the last number I heard, finding a way back into the field. So really, if you want to look at it, I guess in a nutshell, it's oil and gas news with an emphasis on employment news in the oil and gas sector.
Absolutely. And you guys send out also a daily newsletter that has a lot of good content in it. That I've used. I've used it. I think that's how I actually tracked you down online was through the newsletter and adding people to my Twitter following. And they say Twitter's dead. I gotta be honest with you. If Twitter dies, a part of me is gonna die. I just love that thing. It's the best. It's the best in my opinion.
I agree. No, I totally agree. I mean, I watch my Twitter numbers as much as anything because it's such a great. I mean, number one, you can get news so fast.
Right.
I mean, I know people complain about 140 characters, but come on, man. That's all you need for a headline. And then if it's interesting, I'll click on it. But so, yeah, I'm totally with you on Twitter. I think it's one of the best things out there.
Yeah, not that this is the Twitter show, but just to kind of go on that, it's fascinating because, I like to say this. I do have a Facebook account, but I don't really pay attention to what's on there. I've actually made it like a Twitter. I've unfollowed everyone, and all I have is when I get on Facebook is a news feed, stuff I care about. And that's the beautiful thing about Twitter. So for the listeners out there, if you're looking to find information, you're looking to find news stories and all this stuff, Twitter is the place to be. I just kind of plug Twitter. It is a little cumbersome to kind of get set up, but once you build your list out and all that, it is definitely the spot to be. So Twitter, if your stock rises, you can send me a check in the mail for that. We'll take a sponsorship piece as well. So, but.
Well, hey, and send some RigZone's way.
Yeah, RigZone, and send some to RigZone too. So we'll split it 50-50. We'll call it a day.
Well, and the thing about Twitter though is everybody is on it. I mean, I can develop sources in Nigeria just from Twitter, from following people, from picking up news that's happening there, and it helps you kind of keep a pulse. What's happening around the world. It's fantastic for that. So yeah, I can't agree with you enough on that one.
No, absolutely. You can have Snapchat and all that other stuff. Just give me Twitter, and I'll be happy. So, well, look, what else do we need to plug or promote for RigZone or for you personally before we let you get out of here today?
I don't know. We've pretty well covered it. I can tell you some stuff off the record, but I think that's all I've got right now.
We'll have to cut the recording for that. Okay. Well, listen up. We will link to RigZone's website where you can go and you can check out all the stuff they have there. Also, be sure to check out their daily email. I think it's daily. Maybe it comes twice a day sometimes, I would say.
Yeah, it's at least once a day.
Yeah, it's at least once a day that it comes through. It's got a lot of headline stories and stuff like that. And if you're looking for a job, and I've been telling people this on my other little podcast I do, is that if you're looking for a job right now, and then we're recording this on May 15th, and you're kind of holding out, waiting for a better job, you may want to go ahead and jump on one right now because I'm not sure how much the market will expand, but there's people hiring right now, and so it's an exciting time to get in and get a job. And so that alone, having access to that kind of information alone, is worth the price of admission. So thank you so much for coming on. Go ahead.
No, actually, Ron, I just kind of wanted to go back to that a little bit because there are jobs, especially in oil field services. That's where folks are hiring. Now, you cannot expect the kind of money you were making 3 years ago, but you can expect to see jobs out there right now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you can't expect for the money. And also, I was talking to, I was mentioning him offline. This is I think my fourth podcast to record today. And one of the guys I was talking to, he's a driller, and he was talking about, these automated drills that are coming on. And so the discussion that we need to have as oil and gas professionals is, where is technology taking the industry, and where do we need to position ourselves to be a viable piece of this industry over the next 10, 20, 30 years? And so not only from a financial standpoint, yes, I don't want people to take a loss, but the reality is the reality. And so people need to really, I think, in my opinion, if you're still looking for a job, there are jobs out there available. Like you said, the money may not be the same, but it may not be the same for a long time. So don't miss out holding out for, kind of that riverboat gamble, if you will.
Right, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We enjoyed it. We'd love to have you back on again in the future.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again, Deon, for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion. Check her out at RigZone.com. We will link to everything that we mentioned in the show notes at globalenergymedia.com. Hey, I haven't asked for a 5-star review. If you've enjoyed the show, we would really appreciate a 5-star review in iTunes. It's really the most effective way to get the word out about the show. So if you enjoy it and you think, you know what, other energy professionals might enjoy the show, please go to iTunes and leave us a 5-star review, and we would really appreciate that. The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R2 Global.